excited to finally be able to look at a phone from the company simply known as Nothing. But they've certainly done more than nothing in their short existence, and in the 4 years or so, they've released multiple smartphones and audio products, but this time around Nothing returns with the CMF Phone 1, a stylish and budget-oriented Android smartphone that has some interesting features to make it stand out in the very crowded budget Android space. The CMF phone is powered by Mediatek's Dimensity 7300, which is the first time this chipset will be featured here. Now, for those familiar with the channel, we will be exploring the CMF Phone 1's gaming chops and see how it fares in benchmarks, native Android gaming, and of course some emulation. So let's find out together if this budget package is truly going to be the one for many. So let's check out what we get here with the CMF phone and talk about its specs and do a quick unboxing and tour of the CMF Phone 1. The box itself is super minimal, but I do love the art on the front. Now the CMF phone ships with a 6.67-inch Super AMOLED display that supports 120Hz adaptive refresh rates, with a peak brightness of 2000 nits at a resolution of 1080 by 2400 with a very solid 395 ppi. We've got a Mediatek Dimensity 7300 5G, which has 8 cores up to 2.5 GHz and is built on the 4nm Taiwan Semiconductor fab process with a Mali G615 MC2 for graphics. We will definitely be testing its gaming capabilities in just a little bit. The CMF phone ships in 2 different configurations, both with 8GB of RAM, but with either 128 or 256GB of internal storage. This storage is expandable via the micro SD slot. On board we've got Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.3, and a USB Type-C for data and charging. We've got a front-facing 16-megapixel camera and a 50-megapixel Sony rear camera. Now looking around the CMF Phone 1, we've got the power button on the right, volume up and down on the left, microphones on the top and bottom, as well as the SIM and micro SD slot, and a USB Type-C port right next to it, as well as the single speaker that is available here. The CMF phone ships with Nothing OS 2.6, which is built on Android 14, and a 5000 mAh battery with 33-watt fast charging that Nothing claims provides up to 23 hours of video playback, which we will definitely be putting through its paces in just a little bit. Now looking at the rest of the contents here, we have a USB Type-C to Type-C cable, as well as the SIM ejection tool, and then some safety and warranty information. There's no power adapter included here, and as I mentioned, this is a very simple package. The CMF Phone 1 is available worldwide, and in the US it is available through the US beta program on Nothing's website, starting at $199 for the 8GB 128GB model. The CMF Phone 1 comes in black, orange, and a light green. Luckily, I was able to get my hands on the black model before it sold out completely, despite wanting it in either the fun orange or green colors. And speaking of fun colors, the CMF Phone 1's design really brings some of those fun elements back to mobile devices. I miss the days when we had interesting and unique designs, and certainly that is what the CMF Phone brings to the table with its unique interchangeable design through removable backplates and this neat accessory point that really allows endless possibilities. Nothing themselves has various accessories that make use of this, like a kickstand, a lanyard attachment, and even a wallet that can be added through the screws available on the back. But the most interesting aspect to me is the immediate reception by the community to craft all sorts of crazy designs that make use of these unique features. The Nothing team is clearly very proud of this, as they call the CMF phone a platform for builders, and have gone as far as releasing STL and STP files for those that want to 3D print or further build on the basic rear cover design. I've had a lot of fun with this aspect, going through some interesting prints that are available for the CMF Phone 1 this early on already, and Nothing even sponsored a contest for CMF Phone 1 designs over on MakerWorld. I mentioned how I was pretty bummed that I wasn't quite fast enough to secure the CMF Phone 1 in orange or green, but then I quickly realized it didn't really matter because I could either buy those backplates at a later time, or just grab one of the readily available designs off MakerWorld and 3D print my own back cover in those colors, and pretty much any one that my heart desires. The whole principle behind CMF as a brand is to make great designs accessible for all, and I think the Phone 1 accomplishes that. It's obvious there was a lot of consideration made here with the design of the Phone 1, with a better than expected build quality at the price point, an awesome Super AMOLED display that looks great with awesome colors and contrast, and a fairly performant Dimensity 7300, which proves to be far more capable and efficient than expected. And, of course, this seems like the perfect time to talk about synthetic numbers, first with our usual benchmarks, and then we will dive into native Android gaming and emulation as always to get a sense of real-world performance. As I mentioned earlier, the CMF Phone 1 is powered by Mediatek's Dimensity 7300 with a Mali G615 GPU, and it should be a pretty solid performer when it comes to gaming and emulation. So let's first take a look at some benchmarks to get a sense of where it stands among some other common chipsets in the budget Android space. First up, let's get the Geekbench 6 numbers, which will give us a good sense of the CPU performance with the CMF Phone, which came in at 1028 for the single-core score and 2928 for the multi-core score. Now, compared to another very popular chipset that's used in many budget tablet devices and phones, the Helio G99 comes in at 710 for the single-core score and 1848 for the multi-core score. And of course, the Dimensity 7300 compared to that chipset is giving us a nice uplift in this budget space. Now let's check out some of the GPU performance with the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme benchmark, and the CMF Phone scored 856 for this test. And again, just using that Helio G99 as a comparison point, which came in at 340. Finally, for our overall benchmarks, let's check out the Antutu scores with the CMF Phone achieving an overall score of 659,656, a CPU score of 211,458, and a GPU score of 144,017, with that Helio G99 coming in yet again at an overall score of 403,732, a CPU score of 133,760, and a GPU score of 62,935. I think the Dimensity 7300 will bring some solid performance, especially when considering the price point of the CMF Phone at $199 US. One last thing when checking out the benchmarks, I wanted to take a look at the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme stress test, and the CMF Phone has excellent thermal stability at 99.6%, coming in with 851 for its best loop score and the lowest at 848. So we've got numbers, but we need to gear up, and like I've done in the past for other phones and tablets, I always like to show off a selection of telescopic controller options that are available nowadays. There's been some really solid options that have been released this year, and so you can see I've got an assortment of controllers on screen, which includes the ASUS ROG Tessen, Gamesir G8 Plus, the Gamesir X2S, the Razer Kishi Ultra, and an older option with the Backone. Let's start with the ROG Tessen, which is the first time I'm featuring this controller on the channel, and it has a very interesting design that makes it the most compact and portable of the options I'm featuring here today. The controller folds down to take up as little room as possible, and it's definitely a neat feature, especially when compared to the other options that I'm showing here. This controller has really grown on me as I've been using it with the CMF Phone the most out of the options that I have here. I just like how lightweight the overall package is here with this controller and the phone together. This one works great with the CMF Phone, and it fits it nicely, which is easy to adjust since the Tessen does come with rubber spacers to accommodate different thicknesses. Now, if you're like me and also use these on tablets, the Tessen will unfortunately not accommodate anything larger than most phones, so that is something to consider if you like hopping between different sized devices. Now, for a controller that can accommodate something slightly larger than a phone, the Razer Kishi Ultra is another great option, but it's a very expensive telescopic controller, coming in at nearly $150 US, which I think makes it a tough one to recommend for most, especially since the CMF Phone 1 is only about $50 more than this controller. The Kishi Ultra is another one that fits the CMF Phone 1 without any issues, and it is compatible with the device. And the reason I say that is because in my time using the Kishi Ultra over the past few months, I've had instances where it didn't work with certain devices, and so it's again another consideration if you're looking to use this on multiple devices, or at least a different one from the CMF Phone. Now, two more solid options have always been the Gamesir telescopic controllers, and the G8 Plus as well as the X2S are their latest options, with the G8 Plus actually being my current favorite in general. The G8 Plus is a Bluetooth enabled controller, and in particular I love its ability to support very large tablets, but just the overall build quality and the features with the G8 Plus make it a very solid choice, especially for its price point at around $79 US. Both G8 Plus and the X2S accommodate the CMF Phone 1 without issue. And if you prefer a USB-C connection, the original G8 would be the way to go. Likewise for the X2S, it is available in both a USB Type-C and Bluetooth option. Now these are all great options from Gamesir, and the X2S is the more compact option with a different feel than the G8 and G8 Plus. But again, if compactness isn't a concern, the G8 Plus is probably some of the best that you can get. Finally, I wanted to test out an older controller of mine. The Backone has been around for a while now, and it does accommodate the CMF Phone 1 without issue. It's mostly been relegated to a drawer nowadays, but I wanted to show a range of options here, and since the Backone has been around for a while, you can definitely find deals on it if you're looking for a cheap USB-C telescopic controller. Now before we jump into native Android gaming, I did want to briefly touch upon the optimizations that Nothing has included with their Nothing OS that's based on Android 14, and in particular, at least for the focus of this channel, the gaming optimizations which make full use of Google's game dashboard, so we can enable things like the in-game frame counter, which is always helpful to gauge performance. But going further, Nothing has included a game mode that's available under System and Settings. With game mode, you can quickly toggle on a performance mode when you activate the sidebar option. From this section, we can also get into the game dashboard and turn that on as well. The combination of the two features is great for those of us that like using our devices for gaming-focused tasks. For example, with the game mode sidebar activated, I can swipe in from the left and then have access to the performance mode feature that I just mentioned, as well as other adjustments. And if you swipe in from the right, we get the game dashboard features, including the very helpful frame counter. And just for reference, I will be using the game mode performance option for every game test in the Android and emulation sections. So let's start out with some Call of Duty Warzone, and for this one I tested a whole bunch of different scenarios, as we do have some flexibility with the settings. Unfortunately, the game can't quite stay at 60 frames per second with very low visual quality and low settings for resolution, upscaling quality, and shadow quality. So you can either leave it alone and get as many frames as possible with these settings, or you can start to turn up the visual quality and then cap the frame rate to either the standard 30 frames per second or the medium target, which is 45 frames per second. Personally, I think the medium target is a nice balance between visuals and performance, and that is what I'm actually using here for the gameplay footage. But it is nice to see that the game is fully playable on the CMF Phone 1. Now in the time since I've received my CMF Phone, Epic Games has been busy and recently released an awesome game that has finally made the jump to mobile. Fall Guys is a free-to-play, cross-platform, multiplayer party royale game, and this is one that I enjoyed early on with my daughter. It's a fun and silly multiplayer game that is sure to put a smile on your face, and there's no doubt that this one has been highly anticipated for the mobile space. I'm pleased to report that the port is very solid and well done with full controller support, and it does look to be very optimized. I've got Fall Guys here set to its recommended settings out of the box with a 30 frames per second target using the high quality preset. The game does seem to run quite well with these settings. Unfortunately, I can't show the in-game frame rate since the built-in frame counter tools don't seem to play nicely with any of the Epic games. I verified this with some of the other games like Rocket League Sideswipe and of course Fortnite. If anyone has any ideas of how to get the frame counter to work with Epic's games, please do share down in the description, as I'd love to be able to show hard numbers. And while we're on the topic of Epic Games and Fortnite, let's go ahead and check things out with that game and see how it performs here with the CMF Phone, which is definitely going to be a very popular request. For Fortnite, we have a max frame rate target of 30 frames per second using the low quality presets at 100% 3D resolution. And with these settings, the game does stay consistently at 30 frames per second and is smooth with these settings. Thankfully, Fortnite does have a built-in frame counter, so we are able to accurately verify that the performance is solid. I noted only a brief dip prior to making the initial drop, but other than that, it's a solid 30 all across the board in various scenarios. Unfortunately, we do not have the option to go higher than 30 for this game, and it is something that Epic will have to update to allow that option for the CMF Phone, but don't hold your breath because that may never happen. So let's continue on with some more popular free-to-play games. This time around I've got Diablo Immortal, which is definitely not a stranger to the channel and has been consistently featured here. I do like using this game since it's quite solid in terms of controller support, as well as having tons of options to tweak for best performance. For Diablo Immortal, we are yet again set to a max frame rate target of 30 frames per second. And like Fortnite, we do not have the option for 60 frames per second. Since we don't have the option for 60 frames per second, I figure we might as well test how far we can push the game visually, and so I do have the resolution set to high with the very high graphics setting preset, and with these options the game is playable and definitely looks great thanks to these settings. It's a huge bummer that we can't set 60 frames per second for this game, as I think the CMF Phone 1 will be able to handle it without issue. I'm hoping that they will address this in a future update to the game to add it to their list of devices capable of running at 60 frames per second. So for this go-around, I wanted to take a break from Genshin Impact and instead feature another similar free-to-play action RPG with the usual gacha elements. For Wuthering Waves, we have some flexibility with the settings, and you can either prioritize performance or graphical fidelity. The game does well with a 30 frames per second target using the advanced graphics quality, and with those settings, it has no issues maintaining that target frame rate. Now you can definitely turn the visual quality down and go with a very low graphics quality, and as a result enjoy higher frame rates. Now despite the very low graphics quality, we are still struggling to maintain 60 frames per second depending on the scenario. Now this of course just means that we have some flexibility and we can easily go somewhere in between, so we do have some range here to adjust the graphics to best suit your preferences. Now for a game that I've been personally enjoying quite a bit more recently, and it's always a blast to pick up and play, Star Wars Hunters is a free-to-play third-person shooter, and the game really surprised me with its performance here. I've got the game set to use 60 frames per second with high settings, FXAA, and a 100% fixed resolution scale, and Star Wars Hunters runs really well with these settings on the CMF Phone 1, which is definitely very impressive to me. The game is a real treat visually, and it's nice being able to push the performance here with the CMF Phone, which is clearly capable of more than what we've been seeing in some of the earlier games that I featured for this portion of the video. And let's close out the native Android showcase with one last game before we head into emulation. I always like to feature at least one premium experience that's available on Android natively through the Google Play Store. This time around I've got Little Nightmares, which received an excellent port to mobile devices a few months ago, and is exactly the type of experience I wish we would get more of for the mobile space. The port was handled by Playdigious, who is very well known in the mobile space, providing some of the best experiences on the platform. If you haven't checked out Little Nightmares, I definitely recommend it, and it's available either as a one-time purchase or with the Google Play Pass. Little Nightmares is running great here with the CMF Phone at 60 frames per second, using high settings, and it mostly stays locked to that frame rate. So let's finally jump into some emulation using the CMF Phone 1 with its Dimensity 7300, which should prove to be pretty capable on this front. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised by the performance of the Dimensity 7300 once I got comfortable and loaded up a bunch of emulators and games. So let's start out with some PlayStation 2 emulation using Nether SX2 Classic, and when I say I was pleasantly surprised, PS2 performance was definitely one of those that came to mind. As usual, I loaded up some of my tried and true favorites that I always like to test with any new device, and it was a solid experience, especially for a device that doesn't have any active cooling, and also considering its price point. I started out with one of my favorite racing games ever, Burnout Revenge, and using the NTSC version with Nether SX2 set to use the Vulkan backend at 1x native resolution. The game was very smooth and fluid in holding that 60 frames per second target. This already gave me hope that performance would be really solid, since Burnout Revenge is definitely up there in terms of requirements for a smooth experience, and it is nice that I didn't need to resort to the PAL version. Again, what you're seeing here is without any speed hacks or tweaks, just native resolution and Vulkan backend. So let's check out everyone's favorite benchmark game using God of War 2 and still using the Vulkan backend at 1x native resolution with the NTSC version. For God of War 2, I definitely experienced some dips, but it's mostly staying at 60 frames per second, especially when using the game mode set to that performance mode option. We will be seeing a little bit more of God of War 2 in just a little bit when it returns for both the battery and thermal testing. So let's try out another racing game that I absolutely adore for the PlayStation 2. Outrun 2006 is not only an awesome game, but a great way to test some of the hardware here, since it's a fairly difficult game to run. The good news is I can report much of the same here with Outrun 2006, and the game runs great at that native 1x resolution, using the Vulkan backend and the NTSC version running at 60 frames per second. For this game, it's very important to disable the hardware download mode under graphic options, otherwise you will have a pretty awful time with this game. Finally, let's close it out with another classic PlayStation 2 gem, and one that is also a good demonstration of the capabilities on hand here with the CMF Phone 1, and the Dimensity 7300, which is proving to be quite capable and efficient. Shadow of the Colossus is yet another demanding title that is working well at native resolution using the Vulkan backend and the NTSC version. So let's now check out another Sony platform with the PlayStation Portable using the PP-SSPP emulator straight from the Google Play Store. Now I usually start out with PSP when featuring the Sony consoles, but I gotta keep my longtime viewers on their toes, and instead we'll now talk about some PSP emulation, which is obviously going to be pretty solid, given that PlayStation 2 emulation fared really well here on the CMF Phone 1. We'll start out with the worst case scenario, and for PSP emulation, it looks like the CMF Phone will comfortably hit at least 4 times native resolution, which is the equivalent to 1080p in PP-SSPP for the more demanding games such as God of War Chains of Olympus. This is awesome to see, as games already look really nice and sharp at 4 times the native resolution of PSP. Now, PSP games can definitely have a wide range of performance, and so if we go a little bit lighter with our game selection, we can definitely start to push the upscaling. And I was very pleased to see one of my favorite racing games for PSP, Ridge Racer, running at 8 times the native resolution, which is the equivalent to 4K and completely unnecessary given the resolution of the display on hand here with the CMF Phone 1, but still pretty awesome to see nonetheless. Finally, for a bit lighter games like my usual favorites such as Lumines and Loco Roco, these games will have no trouble maxing out PPSSPP's resolution scaling at 10 times the native resolution of the PlayStation Portable. Okay, so let's now switch over to the Nintendo platforms, and we will start out with Gamecube emulation using the Dolphin emulator straight from the Google Play Store. We will just go right into the game that everyone loves to benchmark, with F-Zero GX and at the Gamecube's native resolution using Vulkan and the NTSC version of F-Zero GX at 60 frames per second. The game is performing really well here. For this game, you will want to make sure to enable the dual core option despite some of the issues with it rebooting the game at the start. It does provide a massive performance uplift, and as you can see, F-Zero is looking very fast, staying at that 60 frames per second target. I also had to quickly throw in some Wave Race Blue Storm because I just love this game and its graphics, and I so desperately want Nintendo to give us a new Wave Race entry. And you know what, I will keep showing Blue Storm and Wave Race 64 until they do. Now continuing on with Dolphin, let's check out some Wii briefly, and I was pleasantly surprised here, but using my favorite game for the Wii, Super Mario Galaxy 2, and I was impressed by how it ran here on the CMF Phone 1. Now for similar results to what you're seeing here, you will need some hacks for this game, specifically the skip EFB access from the CPU and immediately present XFB options enabled, which does break some things in-game, but it's definitely worth it from a performance standpoint since it allows for the CMF Phone 1 to play games like Super Mario Galaxy without any issues in terms of performance. Now since performance is solid with Mario Galaxy 2, this does mean that games that are lighter will not have any issues such as other personal favorites of mine like Muramasa and Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. Finally, for our last platform, let's talk about Nintendo Switch emulation, which has had a pretty turbulent year, but there are those still dedicated to progressing the work of Yuzu. Last time around, I featured Sudachi for the OnePlus Pad 2, and this time I'll go ahead and feature Yuzu Edge. Now, Switch emulation should not be a reason to buy any of these devices, and of course should always be treated as a nice bonus considering performance, stability, and compatibility will greatly vary between different builds, different emulators, and of course different devices. With the Dimensity 7300, we won't be able to do custom drivers, so we are limited to just the default system drivers, which means no turnip support here. And so I fully expect that compatibility and performance will be reduced when compared to Snapdragon devices. So to feel things out, I always start with Cruisin' and Blast. It's a game that I enjoy quite a bit for its fast and frantic racing, but it's also a game I've had a lot of success with across multiple devices of various performance profiles. I was pretty surprised that this one was not at full speed, even when I dropped the resolution scaling, but it seems that this might be the upper end of what's possible with the CMF Phone 1 and Switch emulation, at least in terms of where it has matured up to this point. I didn't want to give up hope just yet, and I tested out another game that I've had decent success with in the past. And with New Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, we are able to get it close to or at 60 frames per second when using the 0.5x scaling. And so this isn't the ideal way to play New Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, but it's still interesting to see here, and for those that just want to mess around with it, it's certainly possible. But there are a lot of games that will work quite well here, and if you stick to mostly lighter games, the experience should be pretty solid. Now games like Animal Well, which is surprisingly a little more demanding, runs at almost full speed at the native resolution with handheld mode. But for the most part, a lot of the easier to run games like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Sea of Stars, and Celeste are working great on the CMF Phone with Yuzu Edge. Now another thing I love to test with Android devices, especially when you pair it with a solid telescopic controller like the ones I talked about earlier, is using Moonlight with Sunshine to stream local PC games, and I've actually started playing Black Myth Wukong, which just recently dropped on PC, and the experience is pretty solid here with Moonlight. I've gone with a 120 frames per second stream since the CMF Phone 1 has a 120Hz display, so we might as well enjoy the higher refresh and frame rates. As always, the strength of your local network is very important, and as you can see, my network is doing a solid job handling the stream with my PC hardwired to the network, streaming to the CMF Phone over Wi-Fi. We have an average decoding time of about 12 to 13 milliseconds with the Dimensity 7300, and while certainly not the lowest that I've personally seen, this is still really good performance and will be a solid experience for most. And speaking of streaming, it seems like the perfect time to talk about battery life and thermals with the CMF Phone 1. And as usual, let's start out with my endless YouTube test, streaming some content at 1080p using about a 30% brightness, which is quite solid indoors during the daytime, and 50% volume. The CMF Phone 1 achieved almost 23 hours of on-screen streaming time, and it did match Nothing's claim of up to 23 hours of video playback. I wanted to also mention that I didn't use battery saver at all for this test, which I will admit I forgot to turn on, and so there's a potential to squeeze a little more out of it. So once the battery was fully drained, it was time to check out its 30-minute charging time, and the CMF Phone 1 does support 33-watt quick charging. Unfortunately, I only had a 30-watt adapter on hand, but this should get us close enough to match the 33-watt performance. And after about 30 minutes, the CMF Phone 1 charged up to about 32%. And for a full charge from 0% to 100%, the CMF Phone needed about 1 hour 40 minutes using my 30-watt adapter, and I'd say that's pretty typical for most current phones. Let's now check out how the CMF Phone fared when I did my lighter test using Yoshi's Island for Super Nintendo with the CMF Phone 1 set to about a 30% brightness and about 50% volume with the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth still on, paired with a ROG Tessen controller. The CMF Phone managed a little over 13 hours of on-screen time, while also still powering the controller as well. And for my high-end emulation test, God of War 2 returns here with the CMF Phone once again set to about 30% brightness and 50% volume. The CMF Phone managed about 6 hours 15 minutes, which is really solid given the size of the battery here, and especially so with PlayStation 2 emulation. This was a nice and pleasant surprise. Finally, we can talk about thermals, which again was a very nice surprise, and throughout my usage of the device over the past few weeks, I was always particularly impressed by how the phone never really got warm or hot to the touch. Like, impressively so. The 3D Mark stability test definitely holds some value here and translates to the real-world performance, and the thermals on the CMF Phone 1 are excellent, with the device never really getting hot under load, such as playing God of War 2 for more than an hour on screen, with thermals never really exceeding 35 degrees Celsius anywhere on the device. And so with all of that, the CMF Phone 1 is a pretty impressive package overall, especially at its $199 price point. The CMF Phone gives us a great screen, great build quality, and very solid performance for a device that is essentially positioned as a budget product. Now, while this video focuses on gaming performance, I definitely recommend checking out other videos to get a sense of the other features available here with the CMF Phone, including its camera performance and the other usual things that someone wanting a daily driver phone might want to know more about. But when it comes to performance, I think many will be very happy with the CMF Phone, and I applaud Nothing for moving the needle forward on budget devices and for making phones fun again, but most importantly, accessible for many. And I hope you enjoyed this journey with the CMF Phone 1, and definitely let me know down in the comments what you think about this phone. One thing's for sure, I know it won't be long before another Android device comes across my desk, but until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.